The first thing I saw was smoke, thick, black, and curling up into the sky like a warning. My heart dropped to my stomach, and I didn't even stop to think. I sprinted across my yard toward the cornfield because I knew that smoke wasn't coming from anywhere else. It was my land, my crops, my hard work, and my family's livelihood going up in flames. Every stalk of corn I had planted and watered with my own hands was being swallowed by fire. My boots pounded against the dry dirt as I grabbed the hose and dragged it as far as it would go, but it was like spitting on a dragon. The flames just roared higher, hotter, spreading from one row of corn to another like a chain reaction. My chest was tight, partly from the smoke filling my lungs and partly from the sheer panic rising in me. This wasn't just a fire. Something about it felt wrong, too fast, too deliberate. Fires don't just start out of nowhere in the middle of the day, not like this. I yelled for my neighbor, who came running and immediately called 911. My hands shook as I tried to spray the hose toward the edges of the flames, anything to keep them from reaching my farmhouse. It was a losing battle. The stalks were dry, brittle from the late summer heat, and they lit up like paper the second a flame touched them. I could hear the fire crackling like it was alive, and the sound made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I wasn't just watching a crop burn. I was watching years of sweat, savings, and hope turn to ash right in front of me. I had moved to this town only 6 months earlier, determined to leave the chaos of the city behind. My farm wasn't huge, but it was mine, every inch of it. I was proud of my land, my barn, and the peace that came with it. I wanted a simple life, to work hard and make something meaningful out of the soil. But of course, peace doesn't last long when you've got someone like Karen living nearby. She was the self-declared ruler of the neighborhood, the president of the HOA, and she made sure everyone knew it. The thing is, my farm wasn't even part of her HOA. I lived on private land, completely outside of their rules, but that didn't stop her from marching over every other week with some new complaint. One time, she stood at the edge of my property and shouted that my old red barn was lowering her property values. Another time she complained that my tractor was too loud and interrupted her wine evenings with her friends. She even had the nerve to tell me I should cut down my cornfield because, according to her, no one likes the smell. I ignored her most of the time because she had no real power over me. She wasn't on my land, she wasn't paying my bills, and she definitely wasn't the boss of me. Still, her constant nagging made her impossible to forget. That's why, as I struggled with the hose and felt the heat singe my skin, my mind instantly went to her. I didn't want to believe it, but the thought burned in my head as hot as the fire in front of me. Could Karen have done this? Could she really be crazy enough to set my farm on fire just to get rid of me? My stomach twisted. No one could be that cruel, right? But then again, she had threatened me more than once. I remembered her pointing her finger in my face just a few weeks earlier and saying, "One way or another, you're going to regret living here." The sound of sirens cut through my thoughts. The fire trucks came screaming down the road, red lights flashing, and within seconds, firefighters were leaping out, pulling hoses, barking orders. I stumbled back as they sprayed heavy streams of water into the flames, steam rising into the smoky air. I wanted to collapse from relief, but I forced myself to stay standing, to watch as they worked, to make sure my house wasn't next to go. My throat burned from the smoke, and my eyes watered so badly I could barely see. And that's when I noticed her. Across the road, standing on her porch with her hands on her hips, was Karen. While the fire raged and the firefighters fought to save my land, she just stood there, watching. She wasn't panicking. She wasn't running to help. She wasn't even pretending to care. She had the faintest smirk on her lips, like she was enjoying the show. My fists clenched at my sides. That was the moment everything clicked into place. The fire hadn't just started out of nowhere. It had been set. And the person bold enough, bitter enough, and reckless enough to do it was standing right across the street watching my life go up in smoke like it was some kind of twisted entertainment. The fire chief came over after a while, his face streaked with soot, and told me I was lucky. Another 10 minutes and my house would have gone up, too. I nodded, but I barely heard him. My eyes were locked on Karen, who was now pacing nervously on her porch as the fire trucks rolled closer toward her property. The look on her face shifted from smug satisfaction to something else entirely, panic. And in that instant, I knew. She hadn't expected it to get this far. She hadn't expected the flames to draw so much attention. She had played with fire, literally, and now it was coming back to burn her. The fire chief's words kept replaying in my head as I stood there, staring across the street at Karen's house. He had said the fire looked intentional, that it seemed to have started near the property line, and the second he said it my mind went right back to the image of Karen standing on her porch smirking like she was watching a fireworks show. The firefighters were still hosing down the smoldering edges of the field, steam rising up and filling the air with the acrid smell of burnt corn stalks, but I couldn't shake the feeling in my gut that this wasn't just an accident. Then I noticed a couple of firefighters break away from the group and walk toward her yard. She froze like a deer in headlights before darting back inside her house. I couldn't hear everything, but I saw them knocking on her door, firm and persistent. She didn't answer the first time. When they knocked again, she cracked the door open just enough to yell that she didn't know anything and had been at the spa all day. The problem with her excuse was obvious. Everyone had just seen her standing outside minutes earlier watching the flames with her arms crossed. It didn't take a detective to realize she was lying. The fire chief pulled me aside again, his face serious. He said they had already found a half-burned box of matches and a gas can tossed behind the fence on her property. That was when my anger boiled over. I had suspected her, but now there was evidence, real proof that pointed directly to her. My heart pounded in my chest as I looked over at her place, wondering how far she would go to try to cover this up. It was one thing to nag me about my barn or complain about my tractor. It was another thing entirely to try and destroy my livelihood. That crossed every line. The police arrived soon after, and the tension in the air became thick enough to choke on. A couple of officers walked up the driveway to speak with the firefighters, and after a few minutes, they went straight to her door. She opened it wider this time, her arms flailing as she started spinning stories. I caught bits and pieces of what she was saying, something about teenagers setting fires for fun, something about how maybe I had done it myself for insurance money, and then, bizarrely, something about raccoons knocking things over. The officers stayed calm, but you could see on their faces that they weren't buying it. One of them asked her if she would step outside to talk. She hesitated, then finally came out onto the porch, wringing her hands nervously. Neighbors had started to gather by then, drawn by the smoke and the flashing lights. They stood in little groups on the lawns, whispering, watching everything unfold. Most of them had dealt with Karen's bossy attitude at some point, and I could see more than a few smirks when she began raising her voice and losing control. She kept insisting she had nothing to do with it, but the officers weren't letting her off the hook. One of them calmly told her that her own security cameras showed her carrying a gas can toward the edge of the property less than an hour before the fire broke out. Her face turned white as a sheet, and for a second she was speechless, her mouth opening and closing like she couldn't find the words. Then she snapped, shouting that it was an invasion of privacy and that she wanted them all off her property immediately. The firefighter who had spoken to me earlier stepped forward, holding up the gas can they had recovered. He explained that her fingerprints had already been lifted from it. She stammered, denied it, then tried to claim someone must have planted it there to frame her. Her story kept changing, and with each excuse she dug herself deeper into a hole. The officers remained patient, but their questions became sharper, and you could tell the walls were closing in on her. I stood there, arms crossed, watching the whole thing play out. A part of me wanted to march across the street and yell at her for what she had done, but another part of me realized I didn't need to. She was unraveling all on her own. Her neighbors were watching, the authorities were pressing her, and the evidence was stacked against her higher than any excuse she could come up with. I saw the moment it hit her that she couldn't talk her way out of it. She started crying, then screaming, then pointing her finger at me. "He did it," she shrieked. "He set his own cornfield on fire to make me look bad." The officer raised an eyebrow and asked her how my fingerprints had magically ended up on the gas can in her yard. She had no answer. Her panic was almost pitiful to watch, but my anger kept me from feeling any sympathy. She had tried to destroy everything I'd worked for out of spite, out of some twisted need to control what she had no right to control. Now she was squirming, trying to escape the trap she had set for herself, but there was no way out. The officers told her she needed to come down to the station for questioning. She argued, yelled, threatened lawsuits, but in the end, when they pulled out the handcuffs, her voice cracked. She begged them not to take her in front of everyone. She pleaded that it was all a mistake. But the officers didn't budge. They read her rights as the neighborhood stood silently watching. The sight of her being led down the porch steps in handcuffs was surreal. This was the same woman who had stormed onto my property a dozen times, wagging her finger, barking orders, acting like she was the law. Now she was red-faced, struggling, and being loaded into the back of a police car while her kingdom of HOA loyalists stood frozen, whispering behind their hands. I caught the eye of one of my neighbors, a man who had kept quiet when she yelled at me before. He gave me a small nod, almost like he was saying, "Finally." I exhaled for what felt like the first time all day, the tension in my chest easing just a little. The fire had scorched part of my cornfield, but it hadn't taken everything. And watching Karen being driven away, realizing her reign of harassment was crumbling, gave me a sense of justice I hadn't expected to feel so soon. The battle wasn't over, I'd still have to rebuild, still have to clean up the charred remains of my hard work, but at least now the truth was out. She had exposed herself for who she really was, and the whole town had seen it. I watched the police car drive away with Karen in the back seat, her face pressed against the glass, and for the first time since the fire started, I felt like I could breathe again. The adrenaline was still pumping in my veins, and my hands were still trembling from the chaos, but deep down there was this growing sense of relief. She had tried to ruin me, but instead, she had ruined herself. The neighbors slowly drifted back to their homes, still whispering about what they had just seen, and the firefighters finished dousing the last of the flames. My cornfield looked like a battlefield, rows of green stalks cut short by walls of blackened ash, parts of the soil smoldering, the barn nearby streaked with soot. It wasn't the total loss I had feared in those first terrifying minutes, but it was bad enough that my heart ached looking at it. Every plant I had nurtured through the season, gone in minutes. But what stood out most wasn't the loss, it was the way people started stepping up almost immediately. My closest neighbor, a man named Tom, walked over with a determined look on his face. He put a hand on my shoulder and said, "You won't go through this alone. We'll help you replant. We'll make this right." I hadn't expected that. Until now, most of the neighbors had kept their distance, maybe because they didn't want to get on Karen's bad side, maybe because they didn't know me well enough yet. But seeing her handcuffed and driven away had broken something in the silence of this community. One by one, people began crossing the road, offering words of support. An older couple said they had extra seed they could donate. Another man offered to bring over his tractor to help clear the burned patches. A woman I had barely spoken to before promised to bake meals so I wouldn't have to worry about cooking while I worked on repairs. It was like the fire had lit something inside the community that Karen's constant bossing and intimidation had kept buried. That night, when the last fire truck pulled away and the road finally grew quiet again, I stood at the edge of my field and let the cool night air wash over me. The sky was hazy with smoke, the smell of burnt crops still clinging to everything, but above it all the stars were visible, steady and endless. I thought about how close I had come to losing everything. If the firefighters had been a few minutes later, if the wind had shifted just slightly, my farmhouse could have gone up in flames too. The idea made me shiver, but it also made me grateful. I still had a roof over my head. I still had land. And I still had neighbors who, despite everything, had shown that they cared. The next few days were a blur of cleanup and rebuilding. People kept their word. Trucks pulled up with tools, families brought food, kids even helped clear debris. I found myself surrounded by a team of hands that made the work lighter and the burden easier to carry. And every time someone offered their help, they added the same comment. It's about time someone put Karen in her place. It turned out, I wasn't the only one she had harassed. She had written nasty letters about people's lawn decorations, yelled at kids for riding bikes near her yard, and even threatened to fine families for parking in front of their own houses. She had ruled the neighborhood with fear, and now that fear was gone. Seeing her escorted into a police car had given everyone else the courage to finally speak out. Meanwhile, the authorities weren't gentle with her case. The evidence was overwhelming: security footage, fingerprints on the gas can, and even witnesses who saw her carrying it out to the property line. Arson isn't something the law takes lightly, especially when it puts lives at risk. The charges came fast, and the gossip around town came even faster. Every time I went into the local store, someone would stop me and say, "Heard about Karen, she's finished," or "She always thought she was untouchable." Guess not. Word was she was facing serious time, and the HOA board had already voted to remove her from her position. Her fall from power was complete, and the whole town was watching it unfold like the ending of a drama series. One evening, after a long day of replanting with the help of my neighbors, I sat on my porch with a glass of cold water and thought about how fast things had changed. A week ago, Karen had been a thorn in my side, barging onto my land, barking orders, acting like she owned the world. I had tried to ignore her, thinking she couldn't really touch me since I wasn't part of her HOA. But I had underestimated just how far her bitterness would push her. She had been willing to risk everything, even her own freedom, just to try to drive me out. And in the end, she had only driven herself into a cage. The funny thing is, I didn't even have to lift a finger. I hadn't gone after her. I hadn't tried to get revenge. She had destroyed herself by making one reckless, hateful choice. Watching it happen taught me something important, that sometimes, the best thing you can do is stand your ground and let the truth do the work. The world has a way of catching up with people who thrive on cruelty and control. A month later, my farm was showing signs of life again. Fresh green shoots were pushing up through the blackened soil, proof that the land could heal just like I could. The neighbors still came by often, some to lend a hand, some just to chat, and I realized I had gained something even more valuable than a field of corn. I had gained a community. People I barely knew had become friends, allies, even family in a way. And Karen? She was nowhere to be seen. Rumor had it she had been denied bail and was awaiting trial. Her big house with its manicured lawn stood empty and quiet, a stark reminder of how quickly arrogance can crumble. As I stood there one morning, looking out over the replanted rows, I felt something I hadn't felt in months: peace. True, quiet peace. The kind I had been searching for when I moved here in the first place. Karen had thought she could burn me out, but all she had done was clear the way for something better to grow. My farm would recover. My neighbors and I had built something stronger than any HOA rule, a bond of trust and resilience. And every time I saw those green shoots pushing higher, I was reminded that no matter how destructive the fire, life has a way of coming back even stronger. So when people ask me now if I regret moving here, I smile and shake my head. Sure, I lost a lot that day, but I also gained something priceless. And as for Karen, well, let's just say the only thing she managed to set on fire in the end was her own life.